She weighed 230 pounds, had calluses on both hands, and walked into Redstone Valley Ranch carrying one bag and no reputation. The cowboys laughed before she reached the gate. By nightfall, every one of them had gone silent, because while they stood outside watching a barn full of horses burn alive, Mara Whitlock walked through the door. Nobody sent her in. Nobody asked her to go. She just went. And if you think this story is about a woman who saved some horses, you have no idea what's coming. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The wagon that brought Mara Whitlock to Redstone Valley belonged to a feed merchant named Duval, who talked without stopping for 6 hours and asked her nothing about herself, which suited her fine. She sat in the back with a flour sack between her boots and watched the land change. The flat brown scrub giving way to red rock formations, the sky going wide and pale and merciless in the way frontier sky did when it wanted you to understand you were small. She'd seen country like this before. Her father had dragged her across 3 territories by the time she was 12, and she'd learned early that land with that kind of face, that open, indifferent, sun-hammered face, didn't care about you one way or another. You either figured out how to read it, or you didn't. Duval dropped her at the main gate of the Crow property just before 4 in the afternoon. He didn't wait to see if anyone came out to meet her. He just clicked his teeth at the horse and rolled away down the road, and Mara stood with her bag at her feet and looked at the ranch. It was bigger than she'd expected from the advertisement. The main house sat on a rise, 2 stories of weathered timber with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Below it, spreading across the valley floor, were the outbuildings, bunkhouse, feed barn, equipment shed, and at the far end the stock barn, which was the largest structure on the property, and newer looking than everything else, like it had been rebuilt within the last few years. The pasture beyond the barn was broad and mostly brown. A few cattle moved along the far fence line, their ribs visible even from this distance. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. She heard the laughter before she reached the porch steps. There were 4 of them leaning against the fence rail near the equipment shed. Ranch hands, mid-20s to mid-30s, the kind of men who spent enough time outdoors that they forgot other kinds of people existed. One of them elbowed the man next to him and said something she couldn't make out, and then 2 of them were grinning. She kept walking. The one who stepped forward had a face like a boot heel, flat, creased, and not particularly welcoming. He had a toothpick in the corner of his mouth and his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he looked her over in the slow, deliberate way men did when they wanted you to know they were doing it. "You the cook they advertised for?" he said. "That's right." "Huh." He moved the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. "You ride out here alone?" "Caught a lift with a merchant." Another one of them, younger, with a sunburned neck and ears that stuck out, made a noise that was almost a laugh. "Long ride for somebody looking for kitchen work." Mara looked at him. She didn't say anything. "Cole Barrett," the first one said, extending a hand. Not as a welcome, more like a test to see what she'd do with it. She shook it. His grip tightened just slightly past what was polite, and she held it without changing her expression. He let go first. Mara Whitlock. "You got cooking experience?" "Enough." "Enough," he repeated, and he said it back to her the way some men repeated things they found funny. "Mr. Crow's up at the house. You'll want to talk to him." He stepped aside. The others watched her walk past. She heard someone mutter something behind her, and she didn't turn around. No. Elias Crow was not what the advertisement had led her to imagine. The ad had been businesslike, terse, practical, the kind of notice a man put up when he needed something done and had no interest in discussing it. She'd pictured someone big and self-certain, the kind of rancher who ran a spread like a general ran a campaign. The man who came to the door was in his mid-40s, with a lean face and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of poor sleep stretched out over a long time. His hair was going gray at the temples. He was broad across the shoulders, but carried himself like he was tired of carrying things, and his handshake was firm but distracted, like a man doing something by reflex while his mind was somewhere else. "Miss Whitlock." He held the door back. "Come in." The inside of the house was clean but not comfortable. The furniture was solid and functional and arranged without thought to how anyone would feel sitting in it. There were no curtains. A coat hung on a hook near the door, a pair of boots beneath it. One wall of the main room held a rack of rifles, and another held a map of the property, hand-drawn in ink, with penciled-in annotations. She noticed there was no sign of a woman's presence anywhere in the house. No small things, no softening details. Either his wife had left or she'd died, and by the look of the place, it had been a while either way. "Coffee?" he said. "If you're making it." He moved into the kitchen and she followed without being invited, which she could see surprised him, though he didn't say anything. She looked around the kitchen while he worked. The pantry stock, the condition of the stove, the way the shelves were organized, and by the time he handed her the cup, she had a reasonable picture of what had been feeding the men on this property for the past several months. Not enough, and not well. "You've been feeding 8 hands," she said. He looked at her. 6, currently. The ad said 10. The ad was written in March. He sat down at the table. Things change. She sat across from him. Outside, the afternoon was going amber, the light thickening the way it did before evening came down. The ad said experienced cook for working ranch, lodging provided, competitive wage. It didn't say much about the work itself. "Cooking," he said. "Mr. Crow." 3 meals a day. The men start at 5. They eat again around noon and then after sundown. There's a wood stove in the bunkhouse kitchen that works most of the time and a better one in here. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'm not running a hotel." "I didn't ask if you were." She looked at him. "How long has the ranch been struggling?" The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes when you ask a question someone wasn't prepared for and doesn't know whether to answer honestly or shut it down. "We're managing," he said. "The cattle I saw along the south fence looked thin. It's been a dry season." "Has it been dry here before?" "Every few years. But this time it's different." He put his cup down. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "I'm looking for a cook, Miss Whitlock, not a land assessor." "I'm both," she said. "My father was a surveyor. I grew up reading land." "I'm not trying to step into your business. I'm asking because if I take a job somewhere, I like to understand where I am." He studied her for a moment. She didn't fill the silence. "The well output is dropped," he finally said. "The creek that runs through the east pasture is lower than it should be. I've had 2 wells on neighboring properties go dry in the past year. The whole basin's been affected." He picked up his cup again. "We're managing." She nodded and didn't push further. "Not yet." "When do I start?" she said. She started that evening. The bunkhouse kitchen was not as bad as it could have been. The stove was smokier than it needed to be. The flue collar had come loose from the chimney pipe, and the cutting surfaces needed work, and someone had been storing dried beans in an open sack that had attracted mice, but none of that was beyond fixing. She made a simple dinner from what was on hand: salt pork and beans, biscuits she mixed by eye, a pot of broth from a neck bone she found at the back of the cold storage. Nothing elegant, but hot, and enough of it, and better than whatever they'd been eating. The men came in at sundown and sat down without speaking to her. Cole Barrett sat at the head of the long table the way a man does when he's decided that's where he sits and doesn't expect to be argued with. He looked at the food, then looked at her, and picked up his fork. She stood at the stove while they ate. She wasn't waiting on them. She was watching. You could learn a lot about a group of men by the way they ate after a workday. The young one with the sunburned neck ate fast, like someone who'd been hungry before and hadn't forgotten it. An older hand, weathered and slow-moving, ate carefully, which meant he had some dental trouble. 2 men near the end of the table talked in low voices through the whole meal, never looking up from their plates. Cole Barrett ate steadily, neither fast nor slow, and once he'd eaten about half of what was on his plate, he looked up at her. "It's decent," he said. "Thank you." "I didn't mean it as a compliment. I meant it's decent enough. The last woman lasted 3 weeks." "Why'd she leave?" "Didn't like it here." He looked back at his plate. "Most people don't." "I'm not most people." He didn't say anything to that, but the man across from him, a quiet one with a dark beard who hadn't spoken yet, glanced up at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. She was given a room at the back of the main house, small and simply furnished, with a window that looked out over the south pasture. She lay awake for a while that first night, listening to the sounds of the property, the horses shifting in the stock barn, the dry creak of the bunkhouse settling, the wind that came down out of the northwest and never seemed to stop entirely. She thought about the water, what Elias Crow had described, the dropping well levels, the low creek, the pattern spreading across neighboring properties, didn't sit right with her. Frontier droughts happened. She'd seen them. But the geography here was wrong for what he was describing. Redstone Valley sat at the base of a substantial range of hills that fed a natural aquifer system. Her father had talked about basins like this, the kind of terrain that held water underground even when the surface dried out, funneled it through channels cut by centuries of snowmelt and rain, stored it in ways that made severe depletion slow and irregular, not sudden in spreading. Something else was happening. She didn't know what yet, but she knew the difference between land that was dry and land that was being made dry. She was still working through it when she heard something. Not wind, not the livestock. A sharp crack, and then a sound like a wave, rolling and low, and then the unmistakable sound of fire. She was at the window in an instant. The stock barn was lit from inside, orange light pushing through every gap in the planking, smoke beginning to come up from the roof line. She could hear the horses, that particular pitch of panic that horses make when they understand something is very wrong and they cannot get out. And she was moving before she'd made any conscious decision to move, out the door and down the porch steps and across the yard at a run. She heard shouting from the bunkhouse, men coming out, but she was already ahead of them. The main doors of the barn were latched from the outside, which told her something she didn't have time to think about yet. She threw the latch and pulled the doors back, and the smoke that had been pressing against the inside came out in a hot rush. She put her forearm across her face and went in. The fire was at the far end, in the feed storage section. It had been burning for a few minutes at least. The back wall was well involved. But the stalls ran along both sides of the center aisle, and she could still move through. The horses were screaming. One was throwing itself against the stall door so hard the whole structure was flexing. She went to that one first. The stall latch was a simple bar design. She lifted it, pulled the door, and the horse came out so fast it caught her shoulder and nearly knocked her off her feet. She grabbed the wall, steadied herself, and moved to the next stall. The smoke was bad now. Her eyes were streaming and her lungs were starting to report discomfort. She kept low where she could and kept moving. Stall after stall, throwing latches, pulling doors, the horses stumbling and lurching out into the aisle and toward the open barn doors and the night air beyond. She lost count. She was just moving, just working the latches, just getting doors open. The ceiling above the storage section collapsed. The sound of it was enormous, not a crack, more like a concussion, a wave of heat and force that knocked her sideways into the wall of a stall. Something caught her arm, a nail or a piece of broken wood, and she felt the sharp tear of it across her forearm. And then she was pushing off the wall and moving again because there was one more stall at the end and she could hear the animal inside. She got the latch. The door swung open. The last horse, a young roan that had pressed itself into the far corner, came stumbling out and she went with it, one hand on its neck, moving fast toward the open doors. She came out of the barn into cold air and chaos. The men were there now, all of them, forming a bucket line from the water trough. Cole Barrett was at the front of it, taking water and throwing it at the barn doors, even though at this point the barn was not going to be saved. And what they were really doing was keeping the fire from spreading to the fence line and the equipment shed. The horses that had gotten out were scattered across the yard, some of them still moving, some standing with heads down and sides heaving. Mara counted them. All there. Every one of them. She stood bent forward with her hands on her knees and coughed the smoke out of her lungs. Her forearm was bleeding, soaking through her sleeve. She noticed this in a detached way, like noticing something that belonged to someone else. "Hey!" It was the dark-bearded man from dinner. He was standing next to her, holding a rag out. "Your arm." She took it and pressed it against her forearm. Behind her, someone came to a stop. She turned. Elias Crow was standing 10 feet away, looking at her. He was in his boots and his nightshirt, and he had a rifle in his hand, though it was pointed at the ground. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite have a category for. His face was lit orange and moving shadows from the fire, and she could see the moment he counted the horses. Saw him do it, saw the number register. He opened his mouth, closed it. How many did you get out? He said. All of them, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. He looked at the burning barn, then back at her, and she could see him working through something, some calculation about what he'd just witnessed. The barn doors were latched from outside, she said. He went still. When I came across the yard, she said, the doors were latched. That fire didn't start from inside. Cole Barrett had moved closer. He was listening now, bucket still in hand, water dripping off the end of it. Elias Crow looked at the barn. You're sure? I threw the latch myself, she said. Someone set this. Nobody said anything for a moment. The fire worked at the barn behind her, loud and indifferent, and the horses breathed and the smoke rose up into the dark sky, and Mara Whitlock pressed the cloth against her arm and waited to see what the man who owned this land was going to do with what she'd just told him. Nobody slept much that night. The barn burned down to its frame by 2 a.m, and by then the bucket line had dissolved into a loose cluster of men standing around the coals with their arms crossed and their faces closed off in the way men's faces go when something's been lost and there's nothing left to do about it. The fire had taken the structure, most of the feed stock, and 2 months' worth of harness equipment that had been stored in the back corner. The horses were in the pasture, still unsettled, moving in restless circles along the fence line. One of the younger hands, the sunburned one, whose name Mara had since learned was Pete, had gone out to walk the perimeter with a lantern, more to give himself something to do than because it would help anything. Mara sat on the water trough with her forearm wrapped in a strip of clean cloth that the dark-bearded man, Reuben, had found in the bunkhouse. The cut was shallow but long, and it pulled when she bent her elbow, and she was trying not to bend it. Elias Crow came and stood near her but not next to her. He looked at the embers. I want to be clear about what you said, he told her. Before, about the latch. I said it plain enough. I know what you said. I'm asking if you're certain. She looked at him. Mr. Crow, I know the difference between a bar latch that's been dropped into its bracket from outside and one that's been left loose. That latch was set. Someone closed those doors after the fire was started. He didn't respond right away. The coals popped and shifted. Somewhere out in the dark, one of the horses made a low sound, almost a groan. It could have been a lantern, Cole Barrett said. He'd come up behind them without either of them hearing it. He was still holding his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly. Feed storage. Dry summer. A lantern gets knocked over. The lanterns in this barn were all accounted for at sundown, Mara said. I walked through before dinner. I was looking at the storage situation. The lanterns were on their hooks and the fire started at the back wall, not at the ceiling where they hung. Cole's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted, like a door that hadn't been properly latched. He looked at Elias. Elias Crow was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Get some sleep. We'll deal with this in the morning. It wasn't agreement and it wasn't argument. It was a man who needed time to sit with something uncomfortable, and Mara recognized that. She let it go. But she didn't sleep much either. By the time she had breakfast on the table at 5:15, she had already been up for an hour. She'd gone out in the early gray light and walked the ground around the burn site. The rain that had threatened overnight never came, which meant the ground held what the night had left in it. Boot prints in the soft earth around the back corner of the barn, where the wall had been thinnest and the fire hottest. 2 sets, possibly 3. Hard to be precise because the men had tramped through most of it during the bucket line, but around the far side, away from where anyone had reason to go, the impressions were cleaner. Big boots, a narrow heel. She crouched and looked at them for a long time without touching anything. Then she walked the fence line along the east edge of the property, where the ground began to slope down toward the dry creek bed. She'd been meaning to do this since her conversation with Elias the first evening, and the fire had made it more urgent, not less. What she found was consistent with what he'd described. The creek bed held almost nothing, a thin trickle running along one side of a channel that should have been running full at this point in the season. But what caught her attention was the ground 100 yards upstream. The earth there had been disturbed. Not recently. The disturbance had had time to compact and for grass to start reclaiming it around the edges. But the soil profile was wrong. Someone had dug here, weeks or possibly months ago, and filled the hole back in. She was still thinking about it when she heard the men coming into the kitchen. Cole Barrett sat down at the head of the table and looked at the eggs and biscuits and did not say anything. The others filled in around him. Elias came in last, dressed for work already, and poured his own coffee and stood at the counter instead of sitting. "I need 2 men on fence repair this morning," he said. "The south line took some damage from the horses last night. Pete, take Aldrich with you." Pete nodded. Aldrich, the older hand with the dental trouble, just reached for his biscuit. "The rest of you start sorting through the salvage. We need to know what can be used and what's gone." "What about the horses?" Reuben said. "They'll go in the equipment shed for now. It's not ideal." Mara set the coffee pot down. "Mr. Crow, I need to show you something." He looked at her. "After." "It's about the creek." The table went quiet in a way that was different from just quiet. The kind of quiet that means people have been waiting for a subject to come up. Elias Crow looked at her for a moment. "After breakfast," he said. He followed her out to the creek bed an hour later, and she showed him the disturbed ground upstream. She watched him look at it, watched him crouch the way she had and examine the soil profile, run his hand along the edge of the compacted fill. "That's been there a while," he said. "At least 6 weeks, I'd estimate. Possibly longer." He stood. His face was doing the closed-off thing again, but it was a different kind of closed-off from the night before. This was a man trying to contain something that was pushing against the inside of him. "My father worked the same kind of basin terrain," she said, keeping her voice level. "The aquifer system under this valley feeds from the hills to the northwest. It moves through a series of underground channels, natural ones mostly, but some of them get improved over time, people adding barriers to redirect flow, that kind of thing." She looked at the filled-in excavation. If you buried a barrier here, in the right spot, you could redirect a significant portion of the water that feeds your east well. Maybe not cut it off entirely, but reduce flow enough that over a season, you'd start seeing what you're seeing. He was looking at the spot, not at her. "That's not something you could prove," he said. "Not from the surface. But if you dug it out..." "I'm not digging up my own creek bed on the theory of a woman who's been here 2 days. She didn't flinch at that. She'd expected it, roughly. "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to look at what's in front of you. The barn fire, the water, the cattle losing condition." She paused. "Have any of your neighbors sold in the past year?" He turned and looked at her. "The Hensley place," he said slowly, "and the Faro operation to the south, both sold in the spring." "Who bought them?" He was quiet. "Mr. Crow." "A land company," he said, "out of the capital. I don't know much about them. They paid low. Both families were in trouble by the time they sold. I figured the drought had hit them harder." "What's the name of the company?" He thought for a moment. "Harlan Holdings. Why?" She had no answer to that yet. She just stored the name. She didn't talk to him about it again that day. There wasn't an opening, and even if there had been, she understood that Elias Crow was a man who needed to come to things on his own schedule. Pressing him would only cause him to dig in. She'd seen that type before. Not stubborn exactly, but slow to move because every time they'd moved fast in their lives, it had cost them something, and now they'd developed a kind of structural resistance to being rushed. So she cooked. She made 3 meals, and she fixed the stovepipe collar in the bunkhouse kitchen so it stopped smoking, and she reorganized the dry goods storage so the mice situation stopped being a mice situation, and she noted everything she observed without saying much of it aloud. What she observed was this. The ranch was not just dealing with a bad season. The kind of gradual, compound failure she was looking at, the water, the cattle, the unexplained barn fire, had a shape to it. Individual disasters could be bad luck, but disasters that stacked on each other like this, each one arriving just when a property was starting to find its footing again, had the shape of intention. She'd been thinking about the footprints at the back of the barn. Narrow heel, large foot, not a working man's boot. The heel was wrong for someone who spent time in the saddle, office boots, or the boots of a man who didn't do his own work. On the third day, she asked Reuben about the neighboring properties. He was in the yard splitting wood, which he seemed to do whenever he had unstructured time, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and he leaned the axe against the block and accepted it without ceremony. "The Hensley place," she said. "You know the family?" "Some." He drank. "Ed Hensley ran cattle there for 12 years. Good man. Quiet." "What happened to them?" "What happened to everybody? The well dried up. Then he lost half his herd in the spring. Sick animals. Nobody figured out why. By summer he was done." Reuben looked into his cup. His wife grew up here. Her grandmother's buried on that property. She didn't want to sell. But they did? When you can't feed your kids, you don't have a lot of choices. He looked out toward the hills. The Farrow family was the same. Harlan Holdings sent a man out in both cases. Made low offers. Both families took them because there wasn't anything else. "What do you know about Harlan Holdings?" "Not much. They're buying up land that's failing. That's what people say." He looked at her. "Why are you asking about this?" "I grew up learning how to look at land," she said. "What's happening to this ranch doesn't fit a drought, not on its own." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cole thinks you're poking your nose where it doesn't belong." "Cole's entitled to think whatever he wants." "He's been here 7 years," Reuben said. "He and Elias have a... It's complicated. Cole's loyal, just not always to the right things." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" Reuben set his cup on the fence post and picked up the axe. "I mean, Cole thinks loyalty means not asking questions. And sometimes not asking questions is how you end up with a burned barn." He split a log cleanly, and she watched the 2 halves fall apart. It was on the 5th day that she found the cattle. 2 of them, in the far east corner of the pasture, lying down in a way that wasn't right. She went to them with Pete, who was the first person she'd found when she saw from the kitchen window that something was wrong, and they crouched beside the animals, and Mara looked at their eyes and the texture of their muzzle skin and the way their breathing was labored and rapid, and she felt a cold, clear certainty settle in her chest. "Get Mr. Crow," she said. "What is it?" "Get him now." She stayed with the cattle while Pete ran. She examined them carefully. The conjunctival coloring, the muscle tremors working intermittently through both animals, the saliva. She'd seen this once before, years ago, when she was a girl and her father was surveying a property in the Eastern Territories, and the rancher there had lost 11 head to a contaminated spring. She'd been maybe 9 years old, but she remembered his face when he figured out what had happened. She remembered the particular expression of a man realizing that what he thought was bad luck was something else entirely. Elias came across the pasture at a pace just below a run, Cole Barrett 2 steps behind him. He crouched beside the cattle. He put his hand on one animal's neck, looked at its eyes. "What's wrong with them?" Cole said. "The water," Mara said. "You don't know that." "I'm going to test it." She looked at Elias. "Do you have beet pulp? Dried, not rehydrated?" He looked at her. "In the salvage from the barn." "I need that, and the cleanest glass jar you have, and I need someone to pull a sample from the well right now, not the trough. Straight from the wellhead." Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Now she's running tests. She's a cook." "Cole," Elias's voice was flat and final. "Get the jar." There was a beat. Then Cole turned and went. The test she could perform was rudimentary. She was working with materials on hand, not a proper assay kit, but it was enough. The reaction between the well water sample and the compounds she could extract from the beet pulp was slow and imprecise, but it produced a color change in the water that should not have been there, and she showed it to Elias Crow in the kitchen that evening, with the 2 of them standing at the counter and nobody else in the room. He looked at the jar for a long time. "That means something was added," she said. "I can't tell you exactly what with what I have here, but the cattle aren't sick from a bad season, Mr. Crow. The water in your east well has been contaminated." He didn't say anything. "This is the same water that feeds the trough the horses drink from," she said, "and the kitchen tap." He looked up at her. "I've been using the rainwater barrel for the kitchen since the 2nd day," she said. "I noticed the taste was off." "You noticed the taste." His voice was careful, controlled. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure yet. Now I'm sure. He set the jar down. He put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the wall for a moment, and she could see the weight of what he was processing. Not just the contamination, not just the sick cattle, but what it meant stacked on top of the barn fire and the creek diversion and the dying fields. What it meant that all of this had happened on his land, around him, while he'd been attributing it to drought and bad luck. Who would do this? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Harlan Holdings has bought 2 properties that went through the same kind of collapse, she said. The Hensley place, the Farrows. He turned and looked at her. Both of them had water trouble before they sold, she said. I've been talking to Reuben. The pattern is the same. That's not evidence, he said. It could be coincidence. It could be. She met his eyes. But it isn't. He pushed off the counter and walked to the window. Outside, the evening was going dark, the last of the light sitting along the ridge of the hills to the northwest, and the pasture below it was gray and still. Somewhere out there, 2 cattle were lying down that shouldn't be. If you're right, he said, not turning around, then someone's been on this property more than once, over a period of months. Yes, and nobody saw anything. Somebody set a barn fire with the doors latched from outside, and nobody saw that either, she said. This is a large property. A determined person who knew what they were doing could move on the edges of it without being seen. He turned from the window. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do yet. Not the controlled blankness, not the tired distraction. Something rawer than that. Something that looked like a man beginning to understand the size of the thing that had been moving against him and finding it larger than he'd imagined. I need to think, he said. I know. I can't act on a test you ran in my kitchen with beet pulp. No, she said. You need a proper assay from a credible source. You need to document everything, and you need to do it carefully. Because if Victor Harlan is what I think he is, he has people and resources, and he'll have answers ready for anything you throw at him that isn't watertight. She looked at him steadily. But you have to start somewhere. He looked at her. A long, measuring look, the kind she'd been getting from him since the first evening, except this one had something in it that the earlier ones hadn't. Not quite trust, but the beginning of something that wasn't distrust. Why do you care? He said. You've been here 5 days. She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated, and she wasn't sure she fully understood it herself, so she gave him the part she was sure of. Because I've watched this kind of thing happen before, she said. And the people it happens to are usually too close to it to see it clearly, and then by the time they see it, it's too late. She picked up the jar with the discolored water. You're not at too late yet. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and reached for his coffee cup, and the conversation ended the way his conversations tended to end. Not with resolution, but with a door left open and the understanding that it wasn't finished. She washed the jar out in the rainwater she'd been keeping in the barrel by the back door, and she dried it, and she set it back on the shelf, and she started making a list in her head of everything she needed to find out about Victor Harlan. Elias sent the water sample to a proper assay office in Caldwell 3 days after Mara showed him the jar. He didn't announce it. He just came into the kitchen one morning, set an empty glass vial on the counter, and said, "Fill that from the east wellhead. Clean hands, don't touch the inside." She filled it, and he was gone by mid-morning, writing out himself rather than sending one of the hands, which told her he understood now that not everything on this property needed to be widely known. He came back that evening without saying what he'd done or where he'd been, and she didn't ask. The results came back 11 days later in a sealed envelope addressed in a careful clerical hand. Elias read it alone in the main house. Then he came and found her at the bunkhouse stove where she was working on the noon meal, and he held the letter out. She wiped her hands and read it. The assay confirmed elevated levels of a sulfate compound consistent with mineral salts used in certain industrial applications, not something that occurred naturally in the Redstone Valley aquifer system. The concentration was high enough to cause gastrointestinal distress in livestock, cumulative organ stress with prolonged exposure, and gradual contamination of irrigated soil. The covering note from the assayer said he'd seen something similar once before, in a mine operation dispute in the Northern Territories, where a competing interest had introduced the compound into a rival's water source over an extended period. Mara handed the letter back. "So it's real," Elias said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of a man arriving at a place he'd been hoping he wouldn't have to go. "It was always real," she said, not unkindly. "Now you have paper that says so." He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked out the bunkhouse window at the yard, where Pete was hauling salvaged timber from the burn site, and Reuben was sorting hardware on a tarp. "I need to think about what to do with this." "You need to think fast," she said. "Whatever's been happening here has been happening on a schedule. The barn, the water, the fence damage last week, these aren't random. Someone's pushing." "I know that." "Then you know they'll push again." He turned from the window. There was something in his face that hadn't been there the first week. A tightness around the jaw. A different kind of alertness in his eyes. The fatigue was still there, but it had changed character. It was no longer the fatigue of a man being slowly worn down. It was the fatigue of a man who'd decided to stop moving backward. "Reuben mentioned you asked him about Harlan Holdings," he said. "I did." "Anything else you found out?" She took the folded sheet of paper from her apron pocket. She'd taken to keeping notes, writing things down in the small, precise hand her father had drilled into her during years of watching him document survey work, and she spread it on the counter next to the stove. "Victor Harlan operates through a company registered in the capital," she said. "Harlan Holdings. According to what I could piece together from Reuben and from the feed merchant Duval, he talks, which occasionally has its uses. Harlan Holdings has acquired 11 properties in this region over the past 4 years. Every single one of them was purchased below assessed value. Every single one of them had experienced some kind of operational crisis in the 12 months before the sale." Elias looked at the paper. 11 properties. "That we know of. The Hensley and Faro operations are the closest to here. But there were others further east along the Ridge Basin. A man named Cutter who ran sheep. A family called Beaumont, who had the nicest water rights in the whole eastern section." She tapped the paper. "The Beaumonts sold 18 months ago. 6 months before that, their primary well collapsed. They never figured out why." Elias's jaw worked. "You got all this from Reuben and a feed merchant." "And from the county land registry ledger, which is public record. Duval goes into Caldwell twice a month. I asked him to pick up copies of the transfer records." He stared at her. "You asked Duval. He charges for the errand, but he's discreet enough when the money's right." She looked up at him. "I paid out of my own wages. You can take it back from my next week's pay if you want." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't want it back." She'd been at the ranch 3 weeks when Cole Barrett finally said directly what he'd been building toward since the first night. She was in the equipment shed, which they'd converted to temporary horse quarters, checking on the animals and making notes about their feed consumption. The contaminated well had been sealed off, and they were running water from the rainwater collection system and from a secondary well on the west side of the property, which was lower yield but clean. She heard him come in behind her, and she didn't turn around. "You've got Elias turned around," he said. "He's making his own decisions. He's making decisions based on what you're putting in front of him." Cole's voice was flat, not angry exactly, but with that particular edge that comes when someone's been holding something in for a while. "You've been here 3 weeks. You don't know this land. You don't know this man. And you don't know what you're doing to this operation by pushing him toward a fight he can't win." She turned then. "Why do you think he can't win?" "Because Victor Harlan has money and lawyers and a company registered in the capital, and Elias Crow has a failing ranch and a contaminated well and a cook who read some land registry papers." He held her eyes. "That's not an even fight." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's the fight that's happening whether Elias chooses to engage with it or not." She stepped toward him, not confrontationally, but directly. "Cole, you've been here 7 years. You've watched this ranch go from what it was to what it is now. What did you think was causing it?" He didn't answer right away. "Drought," he finally said. But the word came out a little thin, like he already knew it wasn't enough. "The aquifer under this valley doesn't fail from surface drought alone. Not at this depth, not this fast." She kept her voice level. You've been watching the same thing I'm looking at. You just didn't have a framework for it. And you do. My father taught me. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite capitulation, not quite agreement, but a crack in the certainty he'd walked in with. Even if you're right about all of it, he said, Harlan's got reach. You start making noise, he'll make noise back. I know. People get hurt in these situations. I know that too. He put his hat back on, which was his way of ending conversations. But at the door he paused. The footprints you mentioned. From the night of the fire. Did you write those down? She looked at him. I did. He nodded once and left. What happened next came to her not in a single moment of realization, but in a slow accumulation, the way water finds a crack, and gradually, then all at once. She was walking the east fence line on a Sunday afternoon when the ground beneath her boots changed. It was subtle, a slight give, a different sound when she pressed her heel down, the way a drumhead sounds different directly over the frame versus over the open space. She'd been over this section of ground twice before without noticing it, but she'd been looking at the fence on those occasions, not the ground. She stopped and went back 3 steps and pressed her heel down again. Her father had showed her this once, in a river basin in the Northern Territories, explaining the way underground channels sometimes left evidence on the surface. Not sinkholes, nothing dramatic, just a faint elastic quality to the soil above a void or a running channel. You had to be slow and paying attention and not looking at anything else. She got down on her knees and cleared the dry grass back from a 6-foot section of ground with her hands. Beneath the grass, the soil was a shade darker than the surrounding earth. Not wet, but retaining just enough moisture to hold color differently. She pressed both palms flat against it. She almost missed it, but it was there. A faint vibration, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as your own pulse if you weren't specifically waiting for it. Water. Moving underground. Not a trickle. Something with enough flow to carry. She sat back and looked at the landscape around her with different eyes. The creek diversion she'd found upstream was redirecting flow. But redirecting it where? Away from the east well, clearly. But diverted water had to go somewhere. Either it was being sent off the property entirely, or she looked at the land to the east, at the way the terrain dropped gradually toward what looked like a dry wash about a quarter-mile beyond the property fence. But then she looked further at the way the ridge curved, and she understood. Victor Harlan owned that land. The Beaumont property was on the other side of that ridge. And if you redirected the Redstone Valley aquifer flow using the right underground obstruction, positioned in the right location, she got to her feet and walked to the fence line and looked east. The land out there was quiet and brown and gave nothing away, the way dishonest things usually looked on the outside. But she was almost certain that if she dug up the right section of the Beaumont property, now operating as part of Harlan Holdings, she would find a water supply that had mysteriously improved in the past 18 months. She would find the other end of the equation. She walked back to the ranch. Mats. She needed someone else to dig. Not literally. Not yet. She needed someone with authority and credentials, someone whose findings couldn't be dismissed or attributed to personal interest. She wasn't a surveyor herself, not officially. She had knowledge, not credentials, and in any proceeding that knowledge would be challenged immediately if it came from her alone. She talked to Elias that evening after dinner when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. There's a way to approach the federal land office, she said. Not directly about Harlan Holdings, not yet. About the aquifer rights. Elias was sitting at the table with his coffee. He'd started staying up later in the evenings. She wasn't sure if it was because he was sleeping better or worse. What about them? Every property in this valley has water rights registered to the aquifer system. If you can demonstrate that the natural flow of the aquifer has been artificially altered, diverted from your property to another, that's a federal water rights violation. It's not a matter of who has better lawyers. It's a matter of documented geology. And who documents it? A federal surveyor, requested through the land office on the basis of suspected water rights interference. She looked at him. You file the request. You don't mention Harlan by name. You say your water supply has declined in a pattern inconsistent with natural drought, and you suspect interference with the aquifer flow, they send someone. They look. And if what I think is there is actually there, they find it. Elias wrapped both hands around his cup. And if I'm wrong, if you're wrong, then they find nothing, and you've wasted a filing fee and some of Harlan's attention. She paused. But I don't think I'm wrong. He was quiet for a moment. The section of ground you described, on the east fence line. Yes. My grandfather ran a line through there in the early days of the property. Said there was an old channel running underneath, something the native people had improved to feed a seasonal water source. He used it for irrigation one summer, years ago. It dried up. He looked at his coffee. Or appeared to. Someone knew about it, she said, and knew enough to use it. That's detailed knowledge of my property, he said. The kind of knowledge you'd need time to accumulate. Or a surveyor's records. He looked up at her. The county surveying records are in the Caldwell courthouse, she said. They're public, but they're not well indexed. Someone would have had to do some work to find the right charts. She held his gaze. But if you were systematically identifying properties with water rights vulnerabilities, looking for places where you could redirect flow without it being immediately obvious, you'd do that research. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind that always came down from the northwest was pushing against the house, working at the gaps around the window frames the way it always did. I'll file the request tomorrow, Elias said. Well, she started building the evidence file the same week. She wasn't entirely sure what she was building toward. A federal investigation, a legal proceeding, something more immediate. But she'd learned from watching her father document disputes that the work itself was its own protection. You documented because documentation forced clarity. It made you identify what you actually knew versus what you suspected, and that distinction mattered, especially when the other side had resources to cloud it. She had the assay report. She had the land registry transfer records Duval had brought from Caldwell. She had her own notes from the creek examination and the fence line discovery. She had Reuben's account of the Hensley family's decline, written out in Reuben's slow, careful handwriting after she'd asked him to put it on paper. She had a timeline she'd constructed from everything she'd gathered, laid out on 2 sheets of paper end to end on the kitchen table one night, showing the sequence of events at Redstone Valley alongside the recorded dates of the sales at Hensley, Faro, and the other properties. When you laid it all out like that, it didn't look like coincidence. It looked like a business model. Cole came into the kitchen late one evening and found her at the table with the papers spread around her. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't gather the papers up. She let him look. He came in slowly, the way a man moves when he's decided to do something but hasn't fully committed to the doing of it yet. And he stood at the end of the table and looked at the timeline. That's the Beaumont place, he said, pointing at one of the entries. Yes. I knew the Beaumont family. Good people. He straightened. Ed Beaumont thought he'd failed. That's what I heard. He thought he'd managed his water wrong, that it was his fault. He looked at her. He wasn't wrong at anything. Was he? No. Cole pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down. He didn't say anything for a while. He just looked at the papers the way a person looks at something that's rearranging the furniture inside them. What do you need? He said, finally. She looked at him. I need to get into the county records office in Caldwell. I need to look at the original survey charts for this valley. The geological ones, not just the property maps. And I need someone to come with me who knows the land well enough to confirm what I'm looking at. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to go to war, she said. I'm asking you to come look at some old papers. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands once, the same gesture she'd seen from him the night of the fire. Then he set it on the table. When do you want to go? They rode to Caldwell 2 days later, Mara and Cole, leaving before first light and arriving mid-morning. She hadn't been to Caldwell before, and she didn't spend time looking at it now. They went straight to the courthouse, a 2-story brick building on the main street, and found the records office on the ground floor. A room that smelled of old paper and ink, manned by a thin clerk with spectacles and an expression of mild, permanent irritation. The survey charts she needed were in a cabinet in the back, filed by year and region. The clerk pulled them with minimal enthusiasm and laid them on the wide reading table, and Mara spread them flat and began to work. The geological survey charts for Redstone Valley were detailed and old, dating from the initial territorial surveys with later annotations in different hands. She found what she was looking for in the third chart, a rendering of the underground water system, the aquifer channels marked in blue ink, the natural flow direction indicated by arrows, the estimated channel capacities noted in margin figures. And there, clearly indicated on the chart, was the old channel under the east fence line of what was now the Crow property. Not obscure at all, once you knew to look for it, clearly labeled with a notation about its historical use for irrigation. Cole was looking over her shoulder. "That's ours," he said quietly. "Right there. And look at where it connects." She traced the line with her finger without touching the paper. The channel ran southeast, away from the Crow property, connecting to a larger underground system that fed. Cole leaned closer and read the notation. Then he went still. "That feeds the Beaumont water table," he said. "Yes, so if you blocked that channel on the Crow side, you'd be redirecting the flow, less pressure feeding into the Crow system, more accumulating on the Beaumont side." She looked at him. "Or wherever the Beaumont water is going now." Cole straightened and looked at the chart for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way men say things they've practiced. Not quite naturally, but genuinely, the effort visible, and somehow that made it more real. "You don't," she said. "I called you a cook." "I am a cook." "You know what I meant." She looked at him. "You were protecting something you care about, the way you knew how." She turned back to the chart. "Help me understand the rest of this. The notation here. What does this marking mean in the context of the Eastern Ridge?" He leaned in again, and they worked through the charts together for the next hour and a half, Cole's 7 years of living on and walking that land matching against the geological record on paper, each one filling in what the other was missing. By the time the clerk began pointedly reorganizing things in their vicinity, they had what they needed. She requested copies of 3 of the charts. The clerk charged her twice the standard rate, either out of irritation or opportunity, and she paid it. Outside, in the sharp afternoon light, Cole held the horses while she packed the copies carefully into her saddlebag. "There's one more thing," he said. She looked at him. "There's a man who comes through Caldwell, works for Harlan Holdings, or he did 18 months ago. He had a dispute with the operation and was let go, or so I heard." Cole squinted into the light. "His name is Orrin Pruitt. He was a field man, the kind they'd send out to assess properties." He paused. "If anyone knows the details of how Harlan's operation actually works, it's probably him." She looked at Cole. "How do you know this?" "Because I pay attention," he said, not without a small dry edge, and he handed her the reins. She mounted, and they turned back toward the road, and the sun was already going west behind them, long shadows pulling out across the dust, and she was already thinking about Orrin Pruitt and what a disgruntled field man might know, and whether knowing it would be enough. Orrin Pruitt was not a difficult man to find. He was a difficult man to get anything useful out of, which was a different problem entirely. Cole knew him from a cattle auction 2 years back. Not well, but enough to know where he drank when he was in Caldwell, which was a place called Murdoch's on the south end of the main street, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of sawdust and sour beer and the kind of accumulated human disappointment that soaks into the walls of certain establishments over decades. Cole sent word through a mutual acquaintance, and 4 days after they'd returned from the courthouse, Pruitt sent word back that he'd be in Caldwell on Thursday and was willing to talk, though the message was phrased in a way that made talking sound like something he was doing under mild protest. Mara went with Cole. She'd considered whether her presence would complicate things. Some men talked more freely to other men, especially in a place like Murdoch's. But she'd also decided she wasn't willing to send Cole in without her and then have to reconstruct the conversation secondhand. She'd learned enough about the way important details got softened or lost in the retelling to know that she needed to hear it herself. Pruitt was already there when they arrived, sitting at a corner table with a glass in front of him that was about halfway down. He was a compact man in his late 40s with a weathered, unremarkable face and the eyes of someone who'd spent a long time outdoors calculating distances. He looked at Mara when Cole introduced her and didn't say anything about her presence, which she took as either acceptance or indifference, and either one would do. Cole sat across from him. Mara took the chair to Cole's left, where she could see the room. You worked for Harlan Holdings, Cole said. He didn't make it a question. For about 3 years, Pruitt said. Field assessment, identifying properties, evaluating water access, soil quality, infrastructure, that kind of work. And they let you go. Pruitt turned his glass on the table in a slow circle. There was a disagreement about methods. What kind of methods? Mara said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not hostility, but the evaluating look of a man deciding how much a person was worth his honesty. Whatever he concluded, he went ahead. The kind that I wasn't informed about when I took the job, he said. I identified properties. I assessed them. That was the work I signed on for. What happened after I submitted my assessments was different. Different how? He drank, set the glass down. The first 2 properties I assessed, I figured the subsequent problems they had were bad luck. Drought, accident, the kind of thing that happens to ranching operations. He looked at the table. By the 3rd property, I knew it wasn't bad luck. I didn't know exactly what was being done, but I knew the pattern. Same problems, same timeline, same result. He paused. Then I found out they were using my survey reports to identify vulnerabilities. My assessments of water systems, soil drainage, infrastructure weak points, things I documented as part of a legitimate evaluation, those were being used to find the best way to damage a property without it looking deliberate. The room was quiet around them. Someone at the bar ordered a drink. I confronted my supervisor, Pruitt said. He told me I was misreading the situation. I told him I wasn't, and that I wanted out. He made it clear that people who left Harlan Holdings with information that could be damaging were encouraged to keep that information to themselves. He looked up. He used the word encouraged. Were you threatened? Mara said. Not directly, implied. He looked at her steadily. I've kept quiet for 2 years. I have a wife and 2 children, and I don't want trouble. A beat. But I don't want what happened to those families on my conscience forever either, which is why I'm sitting here. We're not asking you to testify to anything yet, Mara said. We're asking you to help us understand what we're looking at. The Crow Ranch, Redstone Valley. Do you know it? I assessed it, he said. Then, before she could respond, about 2 years ago. I was sent to look at the valley basin as a whole, a regional survey, they said. Standard work. I documented the aquifer system, the channel distribution, the individual property water access. He was quiet for a moment. Crow's property has excellent underlying water access. The channel system under the east section of that ranch feeds half the valley basin. I noted it in my report. And that report went to Harlan Holdings. Everything I wrote went to Harlan Holdings. Mara looked at Cole. He was sitting very still. The old channel under our east fence line, Cole said. You know about it. I documented it, Pruitt said. Full flow capacity, depth. The connection points to the broader system. He set his glass down. I knew when I heard about the Crow operation having water problems that it wasn't the drought. I knew because I'm the one who told them exactly where to put a barrier to reduce that flow. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. You didn't put it there yourself, Mara said. No, but my report told them where to put it. He didn't look away. That's the same thing, near enough. It isn't, she said. Not legally and not practically. You gave them legitimate survey information. What they did with it is on them. She leaned forward slightly. But what you know is exactly what we need. The reports you submitted, do you have copies? No, I was careful not to take anything when I left. At the time, I thought that protected me. His mouth twisted slightly. Now I see it mostly just protects them. Do you remember what you documented, specifically? Could you reconstruct the key elements? He looked at her for a long moment. I have a good memory for survey work, he said carefully. The kind of memory that can be useful in certain contexts. Would you be willing to speak with a federal land investigator? He picked up his glass and finished what was in it and set it down. He looked at his hands. I told you I have a family. I know. I told you I don't want trouble. I know that too. She kept her voice level. But I'm going to tell you what I think you already know. Trouble has already decided to visit whether you invite it or not. Victor Harlan is not going to stop buying land. The method works for him. The only thing that will stop it is someone with enough knowledge and enough will to put it in front of the right people. She paused. You're not the only piece of this. I have the SA report. I have the land registry records. I have the geological survey charts. I have a timeline that connects 11 property sales to a single buyer. What I don't have is someone who can speak to the internal workings of how it was executed. She held his eyes. That's you. Prewitt was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the man at the bar finished his drink and left, and the room shifted slightly around them. I wanted on record that I wasn't aware of the criminal application of my survey work, he said finally. That's a reasonable position, and I believe it's accurate, Mara said. I want protection for my family if this gets loud. That's for the federal investigators to formalize, not me. But the stronger and more complete the evidence package, the faster this moves, and the less opportunity Harlan has to make it loud. Another long pause. Then Prewitt nodded, a small, tight movement, the nod of a man who'd been holding something down for 2 years and was finally, reluctantly, done holding it. They rode back to Redstone Valley in the early evening, and the whole way back Cole was quiet, in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. His usual quiet was self-contained and settled. This was the quiet of a man turning something over and over and not finding a place to set it down. About a mile from the ranch gate, he said, "How did you know he'd talk?" "I didn't," Mara said. "I thought he might. People who leave a situation like that don't usually leave clean. There's always something left behind. Guilt or anger or both. Either one can be useful if you approach it right." "Which one was it with him?" She thought about Prewitt's face when he said, "That's the same thing, near enough." "Both," she said. Cole didn't say anything else until they reached the gate. Odd. She rebuilt the evidence file that night, incorporating what Prewitt had told them. She sat at the kitchen table after midnight with a lamp and a fresh sheet of paper, and she wrote out a clean, sequential account. The assay results, the geological survey charts, the land registry transfers, the timeline, Prewitt's account of the survey work and its applications. She kept the language factual and plain, the way her father had written his dispute documentation, because plain language was harder to challenge than elaborate language, and she knew enough about how these things got pulled apart to know that clarity was her best defense. She was still writing when she heard the front door of the main house open. She looked up. Elias came into the kitchen. He was dressed, which meant he hadn't been to bed. He looked at the papers on the table and then at her. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "I'm finishing the documentation." He sat down across from her and looked at what she'd written. She watched him read, not the careful performance of a man pretending to read while he waited to speak, but actual reading, his eyes moving slowly, stopping occasionally. "Prewitt," he said. "He'll stand behind this?" "He said he would. He's frightened, but he's more frightened of carrying it quietly for the rest of his life." She looked at Elias. "The Federal Land Office request you filed? Any response?" "A letter last week. They're sending a surveyor in about 3 weeks." "That's the right timeline. I want this documentation complete and submitted to the investigator the day they arrive, before anyone has a chance to muddy it." She paused. "We need to think about what Harlan does when he realizes we've been building this." Elias's expression was careful. "What do you mean?" "He's been escalating the pressure here. Barn fire, contaminated water, fence damage. So far it's been damage, aimed at breaking down the operation's viability. But if he learns there's a federal surveyor coming and an evidence file being built, the calculation changes." She set her pen down. "He might try to take the file, or he might try something more direct." The kitchen was quiet. The lamp flame bent slightly in a draft from the window. "You think he'd come here?" Elias said. "I think when someone has that much to lose, they stop thinking the way they normally think. The careful approach stops working in their mind and they reach for something faster." She met his gaze. "I want to make sure we're ready if that happens." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Cole talked to me when you two got back from Caldwell. Told me about Prewitt. Told me some other things too." He looked at the table. "He said I should listen to you." Coming from Cole Barrett, after everything, she understood the weight of that. "Cole knows this land," she said. He knows these people. I don't yet. She paused. We need both. The wire fence along the north border of the property was cut 11 days later. Pete found it on his morning check and came back to report it. And Mara saw from his face before he opened his mouth that it wasn't ordinary fence damage. 2 sections down, clean cuts, the kind a man with wire cutters makes when he's working fast in the dark. 3 cattle had gotten out through the gap during the night and wandered northeast. Pete and Aldrich spent most of the morning recovering them. Mara walked the fence line herself that afternoon and found what she expected. The same narrow-heeled boot print she'd seen at the back of the burn site. Different ground, same shoe. Same person, or the same person's employee. She told Elias that evening. He listened without expression. They know the surveyor's coming, she said. Someone in the land office talks, or Harlan has someone watching the filing records. Either way, they know. And this is the response. She spread her hands. This is distraction. They want us managing fence repairs and lost cattle instead of preparing for the investigator's visit. We can't let that happen. I know. Elias stood up and went to the window. Coles organized a night watch, 2 men on the perimeter after dark, rotating. Good. Mara. He said her name the way he didn't often say it, without the slight formality he usually kept between them. He turned from the window. If I'd had any idea when I filed that ad for a cook, he stopped. You couldn't have known what you were hiring, she said. I couldn't have hoped for it either. He said it simply, without weight or embellishment, and looked at her in the direct way he was capable of when he dropped the reserve. Whatever happens with the investigation, what you've done here already is more than I had any right to expect. She held his gaze. There was something in this exchange she didn't quite know how to hold. Not because it was unwelcome, but because she'd spent enough of her life being overlooked that being clearly seen still caught her slightly off balance. Don't thank me until it's finished, she said. The night they came was the 17th night of the watch rotation. It had been raining since afternoon. A cold, steady rain that turned the yard to mud and reduced visibility to 50 yards in any direction. Mara heard it against her window and lay awake listening to it, and she was not surprised when, around 2 in the morning, she heard horses. Not her horses. These came from the north, from outside the property, moving at a walk along the fence line. She was up and dressed in under a minute. She took the short-barreled rifle from the corner and went to the window first. Through the rain she could see a light. A torch, held low, moving along the tree line. Then another. She went out the back door of the house and crossed the yard in the rain, and she nearly ran into Cole Barrett coming from the opposite direction with Reuben behind him. 3 riders, Cole said in a low voice, coming along the north fence. I saw the torches. Pete's on the east side. Aldrich is behind the equipment shed. Where's Elias? Here. His voice came from behind her and she turned. He was standing in the rain with his rifle, his coat unbuttoned, his face set in the way a man's face sets when he's made a decision and is past the point of unmating it. They positioned themselves across the north side of the yard without speaking much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The ranch had been preparing for this for 17 nights, and the preparation had settled into them, and now it just needed to be executed. Mara went to the left, near the water trough, where she had a clear line of sight across the open ground between the house and the fence line. Cole and Reuben went right. Elias stayed center. The riders came through the fence gap. They'd cut it, she realized, the same section Pete had repaired, and moved into the open ground between the trees and the yard. 3 of them, the torches held low and to the side, the horses moving slow and careful in the mud. They stopped about 30 yards out. One of them called out, "Crow! You in there?" Nobody answered. The rider called again. "This is your last chance to talk business. Mr. Harlan wants to make you a fair offer. You don't have to lose everything." Elias stepped out of the shadow of the house into the rain. He had his rifle at his side, not raised, but not hidden either. "Get off my land," he said. The rider was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're being stupid." "I've heard that before." Elias's voice was steady, more steady than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she doubted it. He was a man who'd been running out of things to hold on to for a long time, and now he had something again, and it showed. I know who you work for. I know what he's been doing to this property, and to 11 others. Federal investigators know it too. A pause, deliberate. They were on their way before tonight. Another silence. The rain came down without interrupting itself. You're bluffing, the writer said, but his voice had changed slightly. Some of the weight had gone out of it. Ride back and ask your employer whether a federal surveyor is scheduled to arrive in this county, Elias said. Ask him whether an evidence file has been submitted to the Land Investigations Office. Ask him those two questions, and then tell me I'm bluffing. One of the other riders said something low that she couldn't hear. The torch on the right side moved, dipped, wavered, and then was extinguished, not dropped, deliberately put out. The first rider sat his horse in the rain for a long moment. She could see him from where she stood, the shape of him against the dark tree line, and she watched him calculate. The torch in his hand went out. This isn't over, he said. No, Elias said. It isn't, but tonight it is. The three riders turned and went back through the fence gap, and the sound of their horses faded into the rain and the dark, and then there was just the sound of the rain itself, steady and cold, and the mud under their boots, and the six of them standing in the yard in the dark. Pete appeared from the east side, coming at a jog. They leaving? They're leaving, Cole said. Nobody moved for a moment. The adrenaline didn't drain fast. It never did. It sat in the body like a tide going out slowly. Mara lowered her rifle. Her hands were cold from the rain and the grip of the stock. She looked at Elias, who was still standing where he'd been, looking at the place where the riders had been. He turned and looked at her. His face was wet from the rain, and she couldn't read everything in it, but she could read enough. He was still here. The ranch was still standing, and whatever came next tonight had not gone the way Victor Harlan had planned. Go inside, she said to nobody in particular. I'll put coffee on. Reuben made a sound that was almost a laugh. Cole looked at her sideways and then looked away. And there was something in that sideways look that was as close to warmth as Cole Barrett probably got on a cold, rainy night. And she thought that was enough for now. The coffee helped, the way coffee always helps. Not by fixing anything, but by giving people something to do with their hands while they worked through what had just happened. They sat around the bunkhouse table, the six of them, rain still coming down outside, and nobody talked much for the first few minutes. Pete had mud on his boots up to the ankle. Aldrich kept turning his cup without drinking from it. Reuben sat with his elbows on the table and looked at the surface of the wood like he was reading something in the grain. Cole was the first to speak. They'll report back to Harlan tonight, he said. He'll know by morning that it didn't work. He already knows the investigator's coming, Mara said. He knew before tonight. That's why tonight happened. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The question is what he does next. He can run, or he can fight, or he can try to make what we have disappear. The evidence file, Elias said. It's not here. She looked at him. I sent copies to Duval 4 days ago with instructions to hold them in Caldwell and deliver them to the Federal Land Office the morning the investigator arrives. The originals are in the lining of my travel bag. A pause. I wasn't born yesterday. Reuben looked up from the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something between surprise and satisfaction. The look of a man realizing the person he'd been quietly rooting for had been 3 steps ahead all along. Cole nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to say out loud. So he can't stop it by coming here, Elias said. He can try to discredit it. He can try to discredit me. Or Pruitt. He can argue the evidence is circumstantial or that the survey charts have been misread. She looked around the table. That's why Pruitt matters. A disinterested former employee who can speak to the method from the inside is harder to dismiss than a cook who read some land registry papers. She said it with a slight dryness, the same phrase Cole had used weeks ago, and she saw Cole register it without quite smiling. When does the investigator arrive? Pete asked. 6 days, Elias said. 6 days was a long time with a man like Victor Harlan aware that he was running out of room. They all understood that, without it being said. Mom. The days that followed had the particular quality of a held breath. The ranch ran its routines, feeding, fence checks, the slow process of repairing what had been damaged and building back what had been lost. But underneath everything was a kind of taut watchfulness that didn't ease even on the quiet afternoons when nothing happened, and the sun came out and the valley looked peaceful. Mara used the time. There were two things still loose in her mind that she hadn't been able to fully resolve, and she worked at them the way her father had taught her to work at problems in survey work, not by forcing them, but by keeping them at the edge of attention and waiting for the ground to show you what it was hiding. The first was the underground channel on the east fence line. She'd identified it, she'd documented the geological evidence, the federal surveyor would confirm it, but she hadn't done the one thing that was within her power to do. She hadn't cleared the obstruction. She went back to the site with 2 shovels and Reuben on the 4th morning after the rainy night confrontation. She'd laid it out for Elias the evening before, what she wanted to do and why. And he'd listened and said, go ahead, which was his way of authorizing things now, clean and without qualification. The digging took most of the morning. The obstruction turned out to be not a simple barrier, but a deliberate plug, compacted clay and rock fill, packed into the channel at a depth of about 4 feet, designed to resist casual discovery, but not a determined excavation. When Reuben's shovel broke through the last section of it, they both felt the ground change. A subtle shift, the clay around the hole going darker almost immediately as the pressure equalized and the water below found its old path again. Reuben sat back on his heels and looked at the hole. Huh, he said, which was probably as close to awe as Reuben got about most things. It'll take a few weeks to fully reestablish pressure through the system, Mara said, but the east well should start showing improvement within 10 days. You knew it was there. I suspected it. The geology suggested it. She looked at the excavated plug, the deliberate layers of fill, the care someone had taken with it. Someone knew exactly what they were doing when they put this in. This isn't amateur work. Harlan's people. Someone he hired who understood aquifer systems, maybe the same person who specified the contamination compound. She thought again of Pruitt, of his survey reports, of all the detailed technical information he'd handed over without knowing what it would be used for. You use the right knowledge in the wrong hands, and it becomes a weapon. Reuben picked up his shovel. Think it'll hold? The channel, once it reopens. If the obstruction is fully removed and the channel walls haven't been damaged, yes, the natural flow will reestablish. She stood and looked at the ground around the excavation, the careful, wrongly colored fill, now piled to the side, exposed and inert. The land doesn't forget where its water wants to go. You just have to stop blocking it. What? The second thing she'd been turning over was simpler and more personal and harder. It was Elias. She was not a woman who allowed herself much territory in that direction. She'd learned early that certain things were expensive to want, and she'd become disciplined about not wanting them, or at least not letting herself know she was wanting them. But there were evenings now when she and Elias sat at the kitchen table after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and they talked, not always about the investigation or the ranch, sometimes about other things, the way two people talk when they've been through something difficult together and find out there's more to each other than the difficulty. He told her about his wife, who had died 4 years ago, a fever that came fast and didn't leave. He told her about the years of just managing, just keeping the operation going because stopping felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. She told him about her father, about the years of moving and the way she'd grown up without a fixed sense of home, but with a fixed sense of how to read what the land was telling you, which was its own kind of belonging. She was careful about it. She didn't let herself lean into it more than was honest, because she was also a practical person who understood that gratitude and genuine regard could look like other things, and she wasn't willing to mistake one for the other, not in either direction. But she was also honest enough to know that something had shifted between them over these weeks, and that the shift was real, not circumstantial. That was enough to sit with for now. The federal surveyor arrived on the morning of the 6th day as scheduled. His name was Garrett, a compact, serious man in his 50s with the kind of methodical movements that came from years of precise field work. He came with an assistant and a set of equipment cases that they loaded off the back of a wagon with careful efficiency. He shook Elias's hand at the gate, nodded to Mara when she was introduced without any visible reaction to her being there, which she appreciated, and asked to see the documentation before he did anything else. She sat across from him at the kitchen table while he read through the evidence file. He read slowly and completely, turning pages back to recheck things, which was a good sign. A man who read carelessly was a man who'd already made up his mind. Garrett hadn't made up his mind. He was doing actual work. He looked up after about 40 minutes. "The assay result," he said. "Independent laboratory in Caldwell?" "Yes, the name and address are on the report." "And the land registry transfers, these are certified copies?" "From the county records office. The stamp is on the back of each one." He turned to the geological survey charts. He spent a long time on these, cross-referencing them against his own field charts that he pulled from a case, tracing the channel lines with a careful finger. His expression didn't change, but his assistant, who was younger and less practiced at concealment, glanced up at Mara once with an expression that told her something. "You've located the obstruction site," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "We excavated it 4 days ago," Mara said. "I have a written account of what we found and photographs. A ranch hand has a camera. The quality isn't ideal, but the obstruction material is clearly visible. I also preserved a sample of the fill material separately." He looked at her over the papers. "You preserved a sample." "My father was a surveyor," she said. "He taught me that physical evidence disappears if you don't make it not disappear." Something moved at the corner of Garrett's mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't fully develop. "We'll want to examine the site ourselves." "Of course." "And the witness, Prewitt, he's available?" "He's in Caldwell. He's expecting your contact." Garrett closed the file and put his hands flat on it and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Elias, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table throughout. "Mr. Crow, I want to be clear about what this investigation will and won't be. My role is to assess the physical evidence of water rights interference. If the evidence supports the claim, I submit findings to the Federal Land Violations Office, and they proceed from there. I can't promise you outcomes. I can promise you that this file," he tapped it, "is the most comprehensively prepared preliminary documentation I've received in 11 years of this work." Elias looked at Mara. She looked at the table. "She put it together," Elias said. "I assumed as much," Garrett said. The investigation took 9 days on site. Garrett and his assistant worked the east fence line, the creek diversion upstream, the secondary well, and the east pasture in systematic sections. They took samples, took measurements, took photographs, and wrote things in notebooks with the focused quiet of people who were very good at their jobs and knew it. They rode out to the Beaumont property, now Harlan Holdings territory, with a federal access order that Garrett had the authority to issue, and they were gone for 2 full days on that excursion. Mara cooked 3 meals a day and kept the ranch running and did not ask Garrett what he was finding. She'd given him everything she had. What he did with it was his work, and she understood the difference between your part and someone else's part. On the 8th day, Prewitt came out from Caldwell. He spent an afternoon with Garrett and his assistant in the main house, while Mara kept the hands occupied elsewhere, not because she was trying to hide anything, but because she understood that official processes needed space, and she wasn't going to crowd it. She heard them talking through the wall, not words, just the low cadence of men exchanging technical information, and she went on cooking and let it run its course. That evening, after Garrett had returned to the room he'd taken at the bunkhouse, Prewitt found her in the kitchen. He looked tired. Not the ground-down tired of someone who'd done something hard, but the specific tiredness that comes when you finally put down something you've been carrying too long. "How did it go?" she said. "He knows what he's doing," Prewitt said. "He asked the right questions." He sat down at the table. "He's going to find what you told him he'd find." "I know. Harlan's people did thorough work, but thorough work leaves tracks." He looked at his hands. The modifications to the Beaumont property's water intake, the infrastructure they built on that side to capture the redirected flow, it's not subtle once you're looking at it with the right eyes. He paused. Garrett's got the right eyes. She set a cup in front of him and he drank from it without commenting. Outside, the evening was settling in, the sky going the particular deep blue that came before dark, the land going quiet in the way it did at this hour. "You did the right thing," she said. "I should have done it 2 years ago." "Maybe, but you're here now." She looked at him. The families who lost their properties, the Hensleys, the Farrows, the Beaumonts, Garrett's investigation will open those sales to review. It won't undo what happened, but it gives them a legal basis to pursue restitution. Pruitt nodded. He didn't say anything else. Bachun. Garrett submitted his findings to the Federal Land Violations Office 12 days after he arrived. He told Elias the morning he left, standing in the yard with his equipment cases loaded and his assistant already on the wagon. The findings support the claim of deliberate aquifer interference, illegal contamination of a registered water source, and fraudulent inducement of distressed property sales across multiple properties in this county. He said it plainly, like a man reading a measurement. Victor Harlan and Harlan Holdings will be the subject of a federal investigation. I can't speak to the timeline or the outcome, but the evidence you've provided is substantive. Elias shook his hand. Garrett looked at Mara. The preliminary documentation made this investigation possible, he said. I want that on record with you directly. She nodded. He got on the wagon and they drove out through the gate and down the road, and the dust settled behind them. And then it was just the ranch and the people in it and the particular silence of something having changed. Victor Harlan was arrested 7 weeks later. The news came through Duval, who got it from the county sheriff's office, who had been notified through the federal channel. Harlan had been taken into custody at his offices in the capital, along with 2 members of his senior staff. The charges were extensive: water rights fraud, property fraud, criminal conspiracy, and several related violations that the federal investigators had uncovered in the course of their work, things that went beyond even what Mara had documented. Harlan's operation had been running variations of the same scheme in 3 territories simultaneously. The scale of it, once investigators started pulling threads, was larger than she'd imagined. The Harlan Holdings land acquisitions were placed under federal review. It would take time, months, more likely years, for the legal proceedings to work through, and not every family who'd lost property would recover it. That was the hard truth of how these things worked, and she didn't pretend otherwise. The law was a slow and imperfect instrument, and the damage done to people like Ed Hensley and the Beaumont family wasn't the kind that could be fully repaired by a court ruling. You couldn't give back the years. You couldn't give back the grief of a woman whose grandmother was buried on land she'd had to surrender. But the machine had been stopped, and the families who'd been told that what happened to them was their own fault, drought, mismanagement, bad luck, now had a different answer. That wasn't nothing. In Mara's experience, that was actually quite a lot. The East Well began showing improved output 3 weeks after they'd cleared the channel. Not full capacity. The system needed more time to fully reestablish, but measurably better, enough that the water trough ran reliably again and the contamination risk was gone. The cattle that had been sick recovered slowly. One didn't make it, which was a loss they absorbed without drama, but didn't pretend wasn't a loss. The fields that had been dying came back unevenly, some sections responding faster than others, the way land does when it's been stressed, recovering in its own order and on its own schedule, rather than all at once. By the time autumn came in, the south pasture had enough grass that they were able to graze the herd there again for the first time in over a year. Elias stood at the fence and watched the cattle move through it without saying anything, and Mara stood nearby and didn't say anything either, because some things don't need commentary. They broke ground on a new barn before the first frost. It was a community effort. Reuben had connections with 2 other ranching families in the valley who came out for 3 weekends with their own hands and their own tools, and Elias fed everyone and the work got done the way frontier work got done when people decided to do it together rather than alone. Cole ran the framing crew with the focused competence of a man who was good at building things and knew it. And Pete turned out to have a talent for timber joinery that nobody, including Pete, had known about before this. The new barn went up in sections, rough and solid and smelling of fresh-cut wood, and it wasn't as large as the old one yet, but it was sound, and it was theirs, built by the people who lived and worked on the land rather than by money that came with conditions attached. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, Mara was in the kitchen making a pot of stew from the last of the summer vegetables and some beef Elias had brought back from Caldwell. And Elias came in from the cold and stood near the stove and warmed his hands without saying anything for a moment. "Cole's leaving," he said. She looked up. "Leaving?" "The Hensley place. The Federal Review opened it up, and Ed Hensley's son has been in contact with the county office about reclaiming it. He needs someone to help him get it running again." Elias looked at the stove. "Cole offered. He's known the Hensley family a long time." She thought about that. Cole Barrett, who had spent 7 years being loyal to this land and this man, now taking that loyalty and pointing it at something that needed it more. "Is that all right with you?" she said. "I think it's right," Elias said. And then, after a pause, "I think a lot of things that have happened recently are right, even when they're hard." He looked at her directly. "You're the reason most of them happened. I helped move things along. Mara." He said her name the same way he'd said it on the rainy night, with the formality dropped. "You came here with a bag and no reputation, as a cook, and you saved this ranch. I'd like you to know I understand that. Fully." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the stew was starting to smell like something, and outside the autumn dark was coming in early the way it did this time of year. "I came here looking for work," she said. That part was true. "And now?" She looked at the stove and then back at him. "Now, I'm not sure looking is the right word for what I'm doing here." She said it carefully, not because she was afraid of it, but because she wanted to say it accurately. "I think I might be staying." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that had been careful and contained and held back for so long loosened just slightly, the way a door that's been leaning into its frame finally swings free when the pressure changes. "I'd like that," he said. It wasn't a declaration of anything grand. It was just two people in a kitchen at the end of a hard year saying honest things in plain language, which was the only kind of language either of them really trusted. Mara thought sometimes about what it meant to belong somewhere. She'd spent enough of her life moving that she'd stopped expecting the feeling. Her father had moved because the work required it, and she'd moved with him, and then after he was gone, she'd moved because it was what she knew how to do. She'd gotten good at arriving places and reading them fast and not needing too much time to settle in, and she'd told herself for years that this was a kind of freedom, that being unbounded was the same as being free. She didn't think that anymore. What she thought now was that belonging was not something a place gave you. It was something you built, out of the particular combination of showing up and doing the work and being honest about what you saw, even when no one wanted to hear it. You couldn't inherit it. You couldn't be handed it because someone decided to tolerate you or because you'd been somewhere long enough. You had to earn it through acts, through being the kind of person who ran toward the fire when everyone else was standing outside. Not because you were trying to prove something, but because that's what the situation required and you were the person present. The Whitlock women, what she knew of them, had always been that kind of person. Her mother, who she barely remembered, had been stubborn and clear-eyed and not particularly liked by people who preferred their women softer. Her father used to say that her mother could walk into any room in the territory and within 10 minutes know exactly which 3 things were wrong and exactly who was responsible. He'd said it with the mix of admiration and exasperation that people reserve for the ones they love most and understand least. Mara thought she was probably something like that. She'd made peace with it over the years, with being the person in the room who saw the thing nobody else was looking at, with the particular loneliness of that, with the way it made her both valuable and inconvenient in equal measure. What surprised her at Redstone Valley was how the inconvenience eventually became something else, how Elias had moved from dismissal to skepticism to trust without ever making a production of the shift, how Cole had apologized without making her accept it on his terms, how Reuben had been in her corner from the second night and had never asked for anything in return, how Pete had grown from a sunburned kid who laughed at the wrong moments into someone she trusted to watch a fence line in the dark. None of them were simple. None of it was smooth. There had been arguments and misunderstandings, and 2 separate occasions when she'd seriously considered packing her bag and walking back to the road and letting someone else figure it out. The first time, she'd gotten as far as setting the bag on the bed before the stubbornness in her, which ran deep and was not always her best quality, decided that leaving was not an option she was willing to take. The second time, she hadn't even gotten that far. She'd just stood in the kitchen in the early morning and been angry at the stove for a while and then made breakfast. That was probably closer to the truth of how things actually worked, she thought. Not grand resolve, just the daily decision, renewed without ceremony, to stay and do the work. Cole left on a Friday in November, which was a working day like any other, except that he loaded his belongings into his saddlebags before dawn and ate breakfast at the bunkhouse table for the last time and didn't make anything of it. The other hand shook his hand. Reuben clapped him on the shoulder, which for Reuben was essentially a speech. Elias walked him to his horse. Mara watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear what they said. It went on for a few minutes. Two men who'd spent 7 years in each other's company and didn't have the kind of relationship that wrapped up neatly in a few minutes, but did their best with the time they had. Elias put his hand out, and Cole shook it, and then Cole mounted and rode out through the gate without looking back, which was his way, and Elias watched him go. He came inside. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and didn't say anything. Mara put a plate of biscuits in front of him. "He'll do right by the Hensley boy," she said. "I know he will." Elias picked up his cup. "Doesn't mean I won't miss him." "No," she said. "It doesn't." They ate breakfast with the rest of the hands, and then the day started the way days started, with the list of work that needed doing longer than the hours available to do it, and that was how it had always been, and how it would go on being. And there was a kind of steadiness in that which she'd come to appreciate. Winter came down off the hills over the next few weeks, bringing the cold that scoured the valley clean and the long nights that pressed in early. The new barn held through the first big storm without trouble. The horses stood in their stalls, and the cattle moved through the south pasture, and the east well ran at a rate that was still building, but was already better than it had been in 2 years. One evening in December, Mara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the snow on the hills and the cold stars above them, and the lights of the bunkhouse across the yard where she could hear, faintly, the sounds of men finishing their evening. Pete's occasional laugh, the low murmur of Reuben's voice, someone moving around near the stove. Behind her, Elias was at the table reading through the month's accounts, which were better than last month's by a margin that was real, not wishful. The East Well data and the Garrett investigation findings had been cited in the Federal Review of 3 other Harlan Holdings properties this week, which meant that the work she'd done here was reaching further than Redstone Valley, was helping untangle damage she hadn't even known the full extent of when she'd first sat down with those land registry papers. She thought about that, about the way one decision, to look carefully at something everyone else had accepted as inevitable, could extend outward in ways you couldn't track from where you were standing. She thought about Ed Hensley's son, rebuilding his family's property with Cole Barrett's help, about the Beaumont family, who had gotten word through the federal process that their sale was under review, and who were, by all accounts, cautiously hopeful in a way they hadn't been for a long time. About all the people she'd never meet whose situations had been affected by a barn fire she'd run into on her first night at a job she'd come to because the advertisement was plain and the work was honest and she needed to be somewhere. You couldn't plan for any of that. You couldn't aim at it. You could only do the next right thing in front of you and let it go where it went. The stars outside the window were very clear and very cold and very far away, the way stars are in the winter over open country when there's nothing between you and the sky. She was still looking at them when Elias said, without looking up from his accounts, "You're going to let all the heat out, standing there." "The window's closed," she said. "Still." He turned a page. "Come sit down." She turned from the window. The kitchen was warm and lit and smelled of the dinner she'd made and the coffee that was still on the stove, and Elias was at the table with his reading and his coffee and the particular quality of ease that a person has when they are in a place they belong. And she understood, looking at it, that she was part of what made it look that way. She sat down. Outside, the winter settled over Redstone Valley with its full weight, over the new barn and the recovering fields, and the east fence line where the ground above the old channel had already begun to heal back over, grass finding its way again, the way grass did, slowly and without asking permission. The water was moving. The land was mending. And in the kitchen of a house that had been too quiet for too long, two people sat at a table, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't need to be filled because it isn't empty. That, Mara Whitlock thought, was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of thing you didn't find by looking for it. You found it by doing the work and staying honest and not running when the fire started. You found it by walking through the door.